For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jackie O'Reilly. I am the current president of SASE and the co-director of the Digital Futures at Work Research Centre based at the University of Sussex and Leeds in the UK. And I am really thrilled to be able to have Mark Granovetter here today, who's been such an eminent contribution to economic sociology, to talk about his recent book. Very briefly, I just want to explain the SASE Salon. The idea for these salons was essentially to meet three goals at SASE. One is to provide the SASE community with more content that they could connect with outside of the conference times. Second, it's also intended to meet some of the green goals of the association by those who don't want to travel. It enables them to still be connected with the debates that are going on. And thirdly, it's also to be more inclusive, because there are many people who maybe can't afford to come or aren't able to come, that hopefully it will enable them to still be part of that community in that way. Right, that's very briefly all, I think, to outline what we want to achieve here. And for those of you who are coming to Amsterdam to the in-person conference, the idea of these salons was to help start some of the discussions that we want to pick up around the theme of fractious connections. And when I was writing up the theme for the conference, Mark's work was really invaluable influence, because his work has been a massively important contribution to economic sociology, especially looking at the kind of paradoxical issues around the strength of weak ties and how we understand forms of socio-economic change through the nature of embeddedness, and trying to overcome the dualism between actor structure or agency structure analyses, to take it more and understand how differential effects come about, sometimes maybe as a result of universal changes. And I think in the past couple of years, we've seen quite a lot of universal changes since the financial crisis and the recent COVID pandemic, but the way these have been adapted by countries really varies quite significantly. Right, without taking up too much space, I'm not sure I really need to introduce Mark Granovetter, because he's been such an important contribution to economic sociology, and really also establishing this strand of sociology in a particular direction that had maybe some of its antecedents in what was called industrial sociology and industrial relations. And the way his work has contributed to this discipline has really shaped and formed a new area in the field. And today we're going to be talking about his recent book, Society and Economy. And I'm very pleased also to be able to invite Elaine Coburn, who is the director for the Centre for Feminist Studies at the University of York in Toronto. Elaine also organised a really excellent SASE Salon last week, looking at fractious feminism and feminist solidarities, which when we put it on YouTube, I really recommend for those of you who are interested in that. And Michel Grossetti is director of a research centre at the University of Toulouse as part of the CNRS. And I'm very welcome to have both of you here to contribute your reflections on Mark's work. The way we're going to organise this session is Mark will give a short presentation and outline of what he wanted to do in the book, and tell us about the forthcoming second volume, hopefully, maybe. And then we'll go over to Elaine to give her commentary, and to Michel, and then we will have a quick Q&A after that. So Mark, can I hand over to you, and thank you so much for accepting this invitation to come.
Well, thank you, Jackie, for your very kind introduction. So, as you know, I was trained by Dr. Pangloss, so I'm going to proceed on the optimistic assumption that most of you already know something about my book, Society and Economy, subtitled Framework and Principles, which is the first of 2 volumes, because if you didn't know anything about it, you probably wouldn't be here. So my plan is to do 2 things before we hear our distinguished discussants, and then open things up for general discussion. First, I want to talk about the history of how this book came to be written, also known as as the Beatles said, the long and winding road. And then I want to talk about where I am in drafting the second volume of this two-volume book. So I'll say a bit about the history of the writing. The original due date, and I still have a copy of the original contract, was July 1st of 1987. So that's why I say a long and winding road. So the delay of almost 30 years from the original due date to the time of actual publication, well, that delay was due to many things, teaching, many other things that I was writing, but a consequence of that was that I gradually made many changes in how I thought about what I was doing in this book. And so I dug back into my files, and I have everything in my files. I am, as some of you know, the original pack rat. I dug back into my files to see what the original prospectus for the work looked like, as well as what my early drafts of chapters looked like. And those drafts consistently followed the same plan as my original prospectus. And I can report to you that the project was originally conceived and organized very differently from what you have read in this volume. It's backward. Do you see it backward also? Well, I guess the book could be a little backward. Anyway, it's just how it's. I guess it's this visual framework. My original proposal was to have 6 thematic chapters. One was going to be on the anthropological study of markets, one on the historical study of markets, one on labor markets, one on income differences, one on industrial organizations, and one on the use of game theory in economic analysis. And that last chapter has fallen out completely. And in fact, I have several such chapters fully drafted in that framework from the late 80s and the early 90s. But I became dissatisfied because people would read those chapters and they would say, and this just drove me crazy, they would say, what a great literature review. And here I thought I was trying to say something theoretical. And the problem was that in saying something theoretical was mixed in with all this literature that I was citing. And so people didn't, the theoretical contribution didn't stand out. So I realized that I needed a different way of organizing the book to make the theoretical arguments stand out. So by the early 2000s, I had settled on a different type of organization. I would first write the theoretical chapters, and then afterwards I'd write the chapters on particular topics. So the book would have 2 parts. And I realized after a while that in doing this, I was unconsciously imitating my idol, Max Weber. And as you can perhaps have noticed, my title, Society and Economy, is a kind of a snarky reversal of his title, Economy and Society, trying to, get the order right finally. And what Weber did was he had all these empirical chapters, very, very detailed empirical chapters. And then before those empirical chapters, he put a series of very dense theoretical chapters right at the beginning. But the problem is that he put those at the beginning only as an afterthought. After he'd done all the empirical chapters, he realized that there wasn't any place where he had defined his terms and got all this terminology straight. So he decided he needed a collection of chapters in which he would do that. And so he put those at the beginning as an afterthought. And that, I think, is why those introductory chapters, those first chapters with all the terms and all the definitions, they really seem a little bit endless and opaque. Some of you may have read the 148-page chapter on the economy and the sociology of the economy. It's really, I have really read it, but I really don't try to get my students to do that because it's a little bit painful. Weber had all these habits, like he makes his arguments and then in small print he lists all the exceptions to the rules that he has set out. So he's certainly my idol, but I don't want to do everything the way he did it. And so my intention was that in putting my own theoretical chapters at the beginning, that was not an afterthought. It was just the way I thought I needed to organize the book. It was a serious attempt to put up a theoretical structure that would support the more empirical chapters that would follow in the second part of the book. And so I wanted to make sure that the theoretical chapters were not an endless catalog of terms, which is what Weber kind of did, but rather an account of fundamental principles. So this left me with the problem of how to organize, how to think about, how to organize a set of theoretical chapters at the beginning. And so that I had to think through what were the basic theoretical issues that really mattered in trying to understand the social foundations of the economy. So I looked at all the empirical chapters I had in fact already written, and I thought about what were the fundamental principles which underlaid all these arguments that I've been making. And the ones that I thought kept recurring had to do with norms and trust and power, and then at a more macro level, institutions. And there are other possibilities, and this list of 3 or 4 is arbitrary in the sense that it does not flow logically from some higher level framework or argument. To me, these were simply the critical theoretical matters that I found myself coming back to again and again in analyzing empirical cases. So there are others I could have included. For instance, I could have had a chapter on social status. The great ancient historian Moses Finley, who wrote extremely important books on the ancient economy, especially his book called The Ancient Economy, which was published in 1970 something. Finley argued that the economies of ancient Rome and Greece were not like modern ones, because people were not driven by the desire to maximize profits, but rather by the need to support their status claims in their societies, ancient Rome and ancient Greece in particular. But I decided, however arbitrarily, that important as status is in the economy, it is not as central theoretically or empirically as my trio of norms and trust and power and at more macro level institutions. And I'm not going to try to justify that. It's just how it felt to me, and someone could certainly make other arguments. Another concept that in earlier outlines of the book got its own chapter was a theory of social networks. But by the early 2000s, I had decided that while networks are a critical mechanism in the economy, they did not deserve causal priority. Rather, they are a causal link between the small scale or micro level activity and the macro level of societies, such as the nature of institutions or culture or patterns of socializing. In causal chains, I would say that social networks typically explain how individual action aggregates into larger patterns. In fact, that is exactly the argument of my first published paper, which some of you will know, The Strength of Weak Ties. But because it occupies this critical intermediate causal level, does not mean that networks somehow matter more than any other level of analysis. In fact, one of the arguments of my introductory chapter, my first chapter, is that if you give causal priority to any level of analysis, as does, for example, methodological individualism, then you have sacrificed the flexibility that you need to analyze complex social structures and outcomes. So I think it's important, in my view, at least, to avoid giving priority to any particular level. So where are all the applied chapters that were supposed to illustrate the value of the theoretical framework? Well, what happened was that as time went on, and as the work progressed slowly, numerous colleagues kindly and gently suggested that if I did not want to imitate Max Weber in having the work be published posthumously after my death, then I had better divide the book into two parts, two volumes. The first one representing the theoretical framework, and that's the one you've already seen. And the second study, which is the one I'm working on now, would have the chapters on cases and applications. So I proposed that to my editor and my publisher, and that is exactly how I proceeded. So having decided that in the first volume I needed chapters on norms and trust and power, and then later on more macro level institutions as central theoretical concepts, I thought about what I would have to do as an introductory chapter. And what I did, as you've seen, is to collect all my underlying background understandings and principles that I'd be drawing on all through the rest of the work, so that readers could have a framework for what was to follow. And I would not have to keep repeating these same kind of underlying ideas. So that introductory chapter is different from all the other chapters, I think, in two ways. First of all, it is the one that looks the most like Max Weber in putting together a collection of issues and concepts that I find important, but that are not all clearly related to one another. And second, it's the only chapter in the book that is in fact closely related to some of my earlier work. The rest of the book really is, I think, rather different from anything I had done before. And in particular, in this first chapter, I foreshadow many of my later arguments by contrasting the different, what I call null hypotheses, that scholars in different disciplines implicitly use, explaining why those presenting opposite explanations can both consider them parsimonious. And I especially want to identify what I think of as bad intellectual habits. There's a shortage of those in our intellectual world that I critique throughout the book, especially here come my bête noire, reductionism, functionalism, and tautological or otherwise simplistic cultural explanations, all of which avoid the hard work of doing detailed historical, sociological, ethnographic research. You know, I gave a talk many years ago and where I talked about why I didn't like explanations that invoked culture. And Clifford Geertz was in the audience and he said, "What do you have against cultural explanations?" And I said, well, they're usually tautological and people just invoke them and they can't think of anything else. So, and Geertz said, "Oh, so what you're saying is you don't like bad cultural explanations." And I realized that that was exactly the right thing to say. So I think those kinds of explanations, all those kinds that I am trying to avoid, they avoid the hard work of doing detailed historical, sociological, ethnographic research. I think there's no substitute for hard, detailed work. And I think it may be my background as an undergraduate student of history that makes me think that intense attention to details is always the foundation for fruitful theoretical arguments. And I try to make a clear case for that in the first chapter. So the devil, as we say, is always in the details. And there's also in this first chapter that I introduced some rudimentary discussion of network analysis. It's actually all I threw out the idea of having a separate chapter on network analysis because, you know, I could have developed all the basic ideas of network analysis, but there are other books that do that. And I didn't think I needed to do that here. And I introduced the idea of embeddedness and how this relates to human motivation and the way that social institutions overlap and interpenetrate one another. So finally, so then I have chapters on norms, trust, and power, which most of you know. And then I move to a more macro level, which, by the way, this movement from micro to macro also happens on a smaller scale within each of those chapters on norms, trust, and power. But then in the fifth and sixth chapter on institutions, they are all more macro level and they draw heavily on a few interesting historical cases. And I think it's in these last two chapters that my background as a student of history is most clear. It's also in these last two chapters that I make use of what I call a pragmatist epistemology, which is a very common theme in the social sciences these days. And a lot of scholars in sociology and political science had brought that to my attention. And I think it's also quite consistent, by the way, with the ideas of Lévi-Strauss and Bourdieu on humans as bricoleurs, people just using the whatever is at hand to construct solutions. There was an interesting review of my book by Erhard Friedberg in the Revue Française de Sociology, which some of you may have seen, where he complained that if pragmatist epistemology is really so important to me, then why does it not appear until these final chapters on institutions? And my answer to that is that for better or worse, I am a minimalist. And I just didn't think I needed that until these last chapters, but some of you may have further thoughts on that. Okay, so finally, let me tell you briefly where I am in writing the second volume on cases and applications. So in this volume, my plan is to have a series of chapters that include such important cases as corruption, and I have a reason for putting it in quotation marks that you'll see when you read that chapter. I already have a paper on corruption. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to send it to anybody. Corporate governance, determinant and consequences of organizational form used by businesses, where a major issue is the extent to which separate firms are independent of one another or allied in ways that range from more or less transient strategic alliances to more or less permanent aggregations called business groups, where we think, for example, of the Chaebol in Korea, the Keiretsu in Japan, business houses in India, in Latin America, they're called grupos económicos. The causes and consequences of adopting these forms, if that's even the right term, are far from clear, and they deserve much more systematic attention than they received. So that was going to be one of the chapters. And so I was eager to get to those chapters. I thought I would start out the second volume with something easy, which I imagine would be a clean and simple discussion of under what circumstances economic action is conducted through personal relationships. And well, the topic turns out to be very far from being clean and simple. I thought this was going to be a walk in the park, a real cupcake first chapter, but it's very far from that. So let me say a bit about that. Some economists and economic historians have the idea that modernization means from moving from personal to impersonal relationships in the economy. I won't name them. You probably know who some of them are. I think it's actually, and that's the only way to have an efficient economy. I think it's actually pretty easy to put that aside as being misconceived and misleading. And I do that briefly in this first chapter, but that doesn't take much time, I don't think, because it's just so far off. But what surprised me the most in writing this chapter, or trying to write this chapter, still not finished, is the astonishingly wide range of types of personal relationships in the economy. So it was easy enough to say, well, there's just impersonal and there's personal, is what these other analysts said. But in fact, impersonal is just one end of a continuum, and the rest of it is quite complicated. It's not even clear that it's a single dimension. So personal relationships range. At one extreme, we may say, from the intimacy of kin relations. Well, the kin relations are sometimes anything but intimate, but anyway, kinship relationships are intimate always in a certain sense. To, at the other extreme, and this is something I never imagined, relationships, economic relationships between people who have never even met in person, are separated by thousands of miles, and they trust one another only by virtue of episodic and highly stylized correspondence across thousands of miles. So here I have relied a great deal on the remarkable book by the historian Francesca Trivellato called The Familiarity of strangers. It's a critical source. She talks about the port of Livorno on the west coast of Italy in the late medieval, early modern period, and she looks especially at Jewish traders who were refugees from Spain and Portugal, carrying out trade all over the world, and in many cases with people in the Far East that they'd never met. They'd exchanged only highly stylized. These letters are so stylized that there were actually etiquette manuals written to tell you how to write letters like this, and yet people, trusted people, whom they had never met, only exchanged these letters with, and trade that was very high monetary value transited over thousands of miles based just on this kind of relationship. So that is such a thin reed to build a relationship on. This is why she called the book The Familiarity of Strangers. Now, another type of crucial relationships, there's a number of kinds of crucial relationships in the economy. One of them is relationships of dependence. And there's a wide range of dependent relationships because there are so many different types and causes of dependence. So, of course, we have slaves and masters/owners, but we also have feudal vassals, we have serfs, we have sharecroppers, we have various other kinds of dependent peasants, often bound to superiors simply by the need for protection in periods like anarchic early medieval Europe. There are debates about Black sharecroppers in the late 19th, early 20th century American South concerning whether landowners really were paternal and protectors of their tenants. And in that case, the need for protection derived not from general anarchy, but from pervasive racist ideology and the judicial and penal institutions that resulted from that ideology. But even slaves, you might think slaves, well, you know, all slaves are the same. All slaves are not the same. Slavery is enormously different in different times and places. And so slaves have extremely different roles in different periods and places. So there's actually a long chapter, a long section of this first chapter that I have already drafted on the role of slaves and former slaves in the economy of ancient Rome. In the ancient world, it turns out, by the way, this topic is quite interesting. In the ancient world, slavery was extremely common. The reason it was extremely common was because of the widespread belief. It turns out this belief was not in any sense found only in the ancient world, but widespread belief that if you conquered another nation in war, that any able-bodied people that you had conquered could appropriately be enslaved. And the Romans especially conducted incessant wars. They were extremely warlike. And for that reason, they had hundreds of thousands of, maybe even millions of slaves. And by the way, it's one thing that's very interesting about this is that in the ancient world, there was no one, philosophers, Christians, Jews, there was no one who questioned the legitimacy of slavery under these circumstances. There were no abolitionists, there was no underground railroad, there was no way to escape. Sometimes slaves would try to escape, but there was no place they could go. And so it didn't usually end well. So it's very interesting, and I've been doing some other reading about under what other peoples thought that if you defeated people in war, that you could take the able-bodied people as slaves, and it turns out this was actually quite a common conception. Even I've been doing some reading about American Indians historically, and they had before white people came to the United States. Different tribes of Indians had really incessant wars with one another, quite brutal, in fact, and they certainly enslaved one another. If they defeated another tribe in war, they would take those people as slaves. So it's a very common pattern. So coming back to ancient Rome, it turns out that slaves were likely more than 25% of the population, at least in Italy. And they were indeed slaves in Orlando Patterson's sense of being socially dead. That is to say, they had no identity or citizenship aside from their position as being the property of their owner. And so, that being the case, and there being this profusion of slaves in ancient Rome, I was just astonished to learn that it turns out that most of the businesses in ancient Rome, and this is both the Republic and the Empire, the dividing line usually being 27 to 31 BC, but in both Republic and Empire, most of the businesses in ancient Rome, who ran them? They were mostly run by slaves or former slaves on behalf of their owners or former owners. That's just astonishing to me. And they did so in an efficient and trustworthy way. So I have a long section of that first chapter that discusses how that could have been the case. And there's a lot to say about that, and I'm happy if anyone's interested in that, I can tell you more. There's a lot more to say about the nature of personal ties. And so that's what I'm working on for the rest of this first chapter. This first chapter will probably become more than one chapter because there's so much to know. So for example, it turns out that people from different cultures, how can they do business with one another? Well, there's some reason to believe that one of the main ways that people from quite different cultures can do business with one another is by means of systematic miscommunication. So there's a well-known historian named Richard White. He's actually a retired Stanford historian. And he has a book called The Middle Ground, which is a very, very interesting book, in which he describes relations between American Indians and French, British, and American traders from about 1650 to 1815. And he argues that those relationships were characterized by persistent misunderstandings and miscommunications, and that those misunderstandings and miscommunications were what made trade possible. It refers to this kind of ground of miscommunication as the middle ground. He calls this the middle ground, as the title of his very important 1991 book on the subject. There was a 2011 edition with 20th anniversary of this book where he talks about all the critiques and so on. It's quite interesting. Actually, the political scientist Gary Herigel makes a similar kind of argument, much more briefly. The book by White is very long and detailed, and I don't want to say it's Indian by Indian, but it's really very detailed. Herigel makes a similar argument for how German and Japanese industry following the Second World War followed the requirements of Allied occupation forces in ways that reflected their own cultural understandings of how industry is supposed to be set up, which meant that the resulting industrial institutions did not at all look like what the Allies thought they were going to look like. And that I do talk about in, I think, chapter 6 of the first volume. Now, so misunderstandings, very interesting how misunderstandings work. Another theme of great importance that I will treat in this chapter is how personal relationships intersect with formal legal and judicial institutions. Now, some economists and historians have argued that the mediation of economic action by personal ties gave way to more formal judicial and legal institutions because that's the only way you could regulate contracts and settle disputes. And I referred to that argument earlier as one that is easily put aside. It's actually not that easy. You have to draw on some detailed historical, but I think it's pretty clear that it's wrong. What turns out to be the case is that there have been no periods or places where judicial institutions were not in place and actively mediating disputes. So rather than one displacing the other as things got more modern, instead, the analytic problem is to understand, indeed over thousands of years, what the interaction is between personal relations and the formal contractual / judicial practices. And there's a lot to say about that. And let me just say that there is a very famous, in legal circles, there's a very famous paper, 1979 paper by Mnookin and Kornhauser called Bargaining in the Shadow of the Law. And this is about, it turns out that most divorces don't actually go to lawyers and courts. Most of them are settled informally. And so one might think that that shows that judicial institutions aren't that important when it comes to divorce. And what they show is that if you look at the kinds of agreements that are made in these informal negotiations, they are made with very clear understanding and keeping clearly in mind what would happen if this case actually went into the courts. And so the kinds of agreements that are made very conscious of what would happen if they didn't come to informal agreements, what kinds of agreements would be required by the judicial system. So this is what they call bargaining in the shadow of the law. And it's really a very appropriate phrase for what has happened for thousands of years. There are all the periods during which there was an argument that informal relations gave way to judicial institutions. There was never a period when they weren't both operating simultaneously. And all the informal stuff that was going on was always operating in the shadow of the law. And so even in the earliest periods, people were well aware in drawing up contracts and making agreements with one another of what would happen if there was a breach and it had to go into the judicial system. And so the kinds of agreements they made were made very consciously, with very conscious awareness of what would happen if they couldn't agree, and if they couldn't agree on what happened if there was a problem in following the terms of the contract. So what I'm trying to say is that the formal and the informal never replace one another, but they interact in complicated ways that depend on local details that the contracting parties are well aware of. So even in this chapter that is dedicated to the role of personal relationships in the economy, I can't avoid the study of formal institutions. And by the way, this points out one of the main deficiencies of social science theory, which is that it doesn't really help us understand the interaction between the informal and the formal. So we have, many of you know the famous paper by Stuart Macaulay, which talks about how contracts don't matter anymore in business, and businesses just put the contracts in the drawer and they don't pay attention to them. Well, that may have been true when Macaulay was writing in 1961. It's probably not true any longer. There's a series of very interesting papers by a legal scholar named Lisa Bernstein at the University of Chicago Law School, where she analyzes in very great detail contracts that industrial firms have in major manufacturing industries. And these contracts are very complicated, and they really do pay a lot of attention to them. They don't put them in the drawer. They really do regulate a lot of things that go on. But one of the things that Bernstein finds, which I just think is so fascinating, and you can read her series of papers, some which are still unpublished, but there's a series of published ones. One thing she finds is that one of the main things the contracts are trying to do is to create circumstances in which the informal relationships, the personal relationships between firms engaged in manufacturing can survive and thrive and carry out the regulatory role that they have always carried out. And so the contracts are trying to make it possible for that to continue. So here's again this very complex and interesting relationship between the formal and the informal. And so her papers are really a very interesting window into that. And finally, if we look across histories and cultures to understand why informal relationships matter so much in some places, but not so much in others, which turns out to be the case, what you don't find is that informal relations disappear when formal ones become prominent. That's not what happens. Instead, it turns out that what determines whether informal relationships matter a lot are a series of factors: demography, geography, the extent of economic networks, the nature of ethnic relationships. These all determine the importance of personal relations. In fact, The ethnographic literature suggests that in larger, more urbanized markets, personal relationships may be more critical than in smaller, localized ones, because it turns out that the larger the setting, the easier it is to escape scrutiny or switch to different networks of traders. So you really need more formal relationships. So my goal in this chapter is to develop this theme among all the other themes, and in doing so to create a clearer understanding of how effective formal institutions are, in what kinds of settings, and what the division of labor is between the formal and the informal. Okay, so that is a brief, maybe not brief enough, introduction to what I've been doing and what I will continue to be doing. So I will now let our distinguished discussants tell us what they think about all this.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was fantastic. Let me hand over to Elaine. We've got plenty of food for thought, but let's have your reflections on your review of the book. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so this review is largely drawn from my international sociological review, which is a comparison between Mark Granovetter's work and Thomas Piketty's work. And it's lucky I'm not going to be talking about Thomas Piketty at all, because Michel Grossetti pointed out that the final line in that review is kind of a very unhelpful misrepresentation of some of Thomas Piketty's work. So hopefully I'll get Mark Granovetter a little bit better. Also, I have to say, listening to Mark, I was thinking that, you could have the novel blurb of economy, society and economy, which would be something like misunderstandings, friendship, betrayal, love, death, from, if it was a novel, from, the courtyard, the court chatter of Cosimo de' Medici to working class people who don't want to leave their workplace because of the bonds of solidarities they have with their fellow workers, come enter into Mark Granovetter's imagination and discover, society and economy. So that's if it was a novel, that's what it would be, but I'll try and give you the sober version of it, I suppose. In Society and Economy, and I wrote, as Granovetter is likely to tell you himself, and in fact, as he did tell you, the social and the economic are finally in the correct order. So in this way, the title reworks Max Weber's celebrated volumes to insist that economic life can only be understood as always already social, cultural, and historical. This challenges tenacious mainstream reductionist accounts of the economic developed by Adam Smith in the late 18th century, rooted in the atomistic self-interested actor coordinated by the invisible hand of the market, a model that continues to haunt many economist theorizations today, if less and less convincingly. At the same time that Granovetter challenges the under-socialized human being of economic theory, he rejects the over-socialized human actor of functionalist and strong culturalist models, or maybe not strong, but wrong culturalist models. In particular, he challenges functionalist accounts that explain economic institutions as the necessary solution to specific economic contexts, an approach that encourages ex post facto rationalizations of any given economic arrangements without careful attention to contingencies that detailed historical accounts often reveal. Further, Granovetter is profoundly skeptical of strong culturalist accounts that explain group economic behavior as an outcome of shared beliefs, values, or traits, so reducing the individual at worst to a kind of cultural automaton. In proposing a middle range conceptualization of economic life, Granovetter thus emphasizes human agency within social, cultural, and historical contexts against reductionist economistic accounts. And at the same time, given human agency and creativity, he emphasizes the contingency and diversity of the economy against both functionalist and strong culturalist theorizations. In understanding what he calls the hard core of economic activity, that is individual, collective, and institutional patterns having to do with the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services, Granovetter offers instead what he describes as a realistically complex understanding of human beings, actors who are endowed with agency, whose actions are irreducible to rational self-interest, and whose agency is sensitive to, but not overdetermined by prevailing cultures and norms or well-defined collective needs. Although Granovetter emphasizes the interdisciplinarity of his analysis, his book is resolutely sociological, informed by American disciplinary debates about human beings as social actors endowed with agency, but at the same time, the product of relatively stable institutions and norms, the so-called structural agency problem. In Society and Economy, he offers a parsimonious conceptual apparatus explaining human behavior and economic life, an assemblage of concepts that he hopes is sufficiently nuanced and flexible to explain economic relationships, as he explained to us, at the macro, meso, and macro levels across different historical and national contexts. The movement is from individual behaviors through to patterns of action beyond the realm of single individuals, and finally to large complexes of action, normatively sanctioned as the way that things should be done. Cross-cutting these different levels of analysis, Granovetter considers the role of norms, trust, and power, all three under-theorized by economists, especially with respect to individual agency and the individual's capacity to innovate by mobilizing resources from one network and applying these in novel ways to new contexts. Unsurprisingly, given his central role in developing social network theory, and I think his early articles have been cited more than 100,000 times, Granovetter understands networks as critical to grasping the complexities of human agency in the economy, arguing that they play a central mediating role between the micro and macro levels. So a psychology experiment that he cites that shows that standards of fairness prevail over naked self-interest is a welcome recognition of the powerful ways that norms shape behaviors, so serving as a useful corrective to economistic narratives about the predominance of rational, self-interested, utility maximizing motivations. Nonetheless, Granovetter argues that psychology experiments are insufficient to explain real economic behaviors, since norms do not exist in the dyads of experimental psychology, but instead across relatively cohesive networks. Understanding norms and their consequences, in Granovetter's view, therefore requires investigations of the psychological and moral dispositions of individuals, but also grasping how these are shaped by the individual's embeddedness in social networks with their own collective morality, and how norms travel or conflict with the shared values within other networks, and so across society as a whole. In Iceland, for example, strong norms about the sharing of surplus hay with neighbors in need belie the rational self-interest of economic man. At the same time, they tell a larger story about cooperative norms that ultimately support a relatively strong social welfare state, even if the immediate cost of sharing with neighbors and so failing to store hay for profit results in livestock starvation in lean years. This is one of Granovetter's many wide-ranging empirical examples as he seeks to provide informed researchers with an assemblage of crucial concepts, useful in explaining economic life across different historical and national contexts. So here, Granovetter is correcting a vision of the atomistic individual prevalent in neoclassical economics to emphasize instead that society is more than a collection of individuals. Every society has emergent social properties. Other cases are used to diversely challenge the rational self-interested actor of economic theories and the over-socialized automaton of culturalist and functionalist social theories. In bazaars, as he explained to us, repeated transactions from smaller to more important purchases create cheap, richly detailed, and typically accurate, he writes, information about exchange partners. Offer and demand, regulated by price, do not account for transactional relationships, even in the marketplace, like the bazaar. Instead, trust plays a critical role. In Renaissance Italy, Cosimo de' Medici acted as a unique broker between older patrician families and new wealthy merchants, neither of whom associated with each other for reasons of incommensurate social status, so enabling the de' Medicis to exercise power over both groups as a bridge across this network gap. Powerful figures like Cosimo de' Medici may exploit structural network holes, monopolizing a unique position in relation to both networks, so reinforcing highly personalized economic and political power. In the 1980s, in another example, Silicon Valley teetered between the flexible, small firm, high technology ecology it is now famous for, and much more centralized bureaucratic corporate cultures, emblematically in enterprises like Apple and Google that today are part of the California economic landscape. This challenges functional arguments that confound what is with what must be, since the persistence of organizational variety suggests multiple functional solutions to given economic problems, while recalling the historical contingency that shapes any given regional economic ecology. The effect and perhaps intention of this empirical eclecticism is to make an argument for the broad usefulness of Granovetter's key concepts: trust, power, norms, networks, variously configured to make sense of particular cases, but also to illustrate how diversely human actors solve economic problems. For Granovetter, human beings draw on a wide range of socially available norms, values, and institutional models as they act together and together shape economic life. Given the primacy of the social within the economic, notably including institutions, power, and trust, Granovetter has space for broad reflections on social, that is, human life. If there is an understandable attentiveness to, for instance, the role of the finance sector in contemporary banking, consolidated by close networks ties with key political figures, or the role that Confucian norms play in legitimating contemporary Chinese entrepreneurial initiatives, Granovetter's observations extend to human life writ large. We read that love and deep friendships, for instance, are among, quote, the least understood and most subtle emotions and passions of humankind. So that, he writes, to the extent the relationship is serious and long-lasting, loved ones and close friends become part of the sense of self. With an understated poignancy, Granovetter concludes, this would explain the severe sense of becoming partially unmoored and losing part of oneself when one loses a loved one as the result of death, the ending of a relationship, and perhaps worst of all, by unexpected betrayal. Since economic life is embedded in social and cultural networks, the substantive arguments spill out into these broader existential observations here about the critical role of trust in human relationships and the related heartbreaks of grief and betrayal. Taken on its own terms, Granovetter offers a powerful broadside against neoclassical economic assumptions that strip human beings of their sociality and imagine them as atomistic self-interested actors, while expressing equal skepticism about culturalist and functionalist arguments that imagine that economic relationships and history are easily deduced from widely shared norms or from systemic needs that can only be met by a small number of institutional arrangements. Instead, the human actor that emerges in Granovetter's narrative is one endowed, at least potentially, with considerable agency to, quote, creatively assemble bits and pieces of institutional solutions by borrowing norms from one set of networks or fields to solve their problems in a creative and syncretic manner in another. This ability to apply old solutions to new problems and settings explains social change and economic innovation as human beings make do, fashioning new relationships, norms, and institutions out of existing social materials. Culturalists and functionalists must grapple with this creative capacity, including in economic life. There are limits to human agency, of course, and I'll just skip over this in the interest of time. I can return to them if anyone wants to talk about it. But above all, Granovetter is at pains to show that in their economic activities, human beings do not behave like functionalists who efficiently fit economistic institutions into given contexts. Rather, the less powerful are subject to irrational path-dependent economic configurations, while as Granovetter observes, powerful economic actors may reshape the context to suit their idiosyncratic needs. Nor are human beings cultural robots enacting pre-given institutional scripts. Rather, beliefs and values shift and change, and in particular, entrepreneurial economic actors may take up values and norms from one context and apply them in innovative ways to new contexts. Last but not least, against tenacious reductionist economic arguments, Granovetter shows that human activity is irreducible to rational, self-interested utility maximizing behavior. Instead, human actors are complex and creative. To understand economic life requires attention to dynamics, namely trust, power, norms, and institutions that economists typically ignore. And to this brief account, I will just add two further observations. One is that it's a distinct pleasure of society and economy to read Granovetter's economical or limpid prose. Arguments are stated as simply and directly as possible without rhetorical ornament. It might be noted too that Granovetter is not above a humorous poke at the pretensions and verbiage of his own discipline. See page 17, for instance, where he writes, this concept is about pairs, or as sociologists like to say, dyads. In short, there is a pleasure in reading a sociological work, sometimes humorous, with writerly qualities, and these writerly qualities add to the clarity and force of the arguments. Second, Granovetter's ambition for the text is clear in the main title, borrowing from one of the foremost and still influential works in sociology, as he recalled for us, Max Weber's Economy and Society. Further, the subtitle is at least as ambitious, promising to provide frameworks and principles for an entire field of study known in the United States as economic sociology. Yet there is an understated quality to the erudition and fundamentally the intellectual curiosity. When he was talking, he said, so much to know. And this kind of excitement and intellectual curiosity animates the whole. In my short summary that I have just given, I drew on Granovetter's references to the neighborly norms of 19th century Irish peasants, Confucian ideals in contemporary Chinese entrepreneurship, the unique ability of Cosimo de' Medici to act as a network bridge in 14th and 15th century Florence, and the origins of small, flexible, high-tech firms in Silicon Valley in the 1990s. Elsewhere in Society and Economy, we read about the ubiquity of the English language QWERTY keyboard as an illustration of path-dependent inefficiencies, shame in wartime Japanese society as part of a broader discussion of shame as a powerful form of social control, MRIs or brain scans and how these may reveal two different kinds of moral decisions, one immediate and rooted in emotion, the other slower and concerned with medium and longer term consequences, a brief description of a devastating mistake by FBI agents in the Middle East who catastrophically apply cost-benefit analyses when key cultural norms matter more to political actors with whom they are negotiating, and so on. And the second volume of Society and Economy, as we've heard, promises to describe trust between former Roman slaves and their relationships with those who own them, the role of Jewish traders in early international networks in Livorno in the early modern period, and the electricity industry in the late 19th and early 20th century, symptomatic of a wide-ranging, lively interest in human life across different contexts and historical moments. Together, these eclectic and wide-ranging references powerfully inform a conceptual model whose flexibility owes something to the diversity of sources from which the model is derived and which the model seeks variously to explain. As Granovetter writes on the closing page of Society and Economy, do not underestimate the value of imaginative and well-crafted models in helping to illuminate social life, a conclusion that we might agree with as we take up Society and Economy to help us grapple with the relationship between the social and the economic and in our own work and lives. So thank you so much.
We also have on the website links to some of these very much, Elaine, for that contributions from Elaine and Michel and from Sajeev as well, who couldn't be here today. With no further ado, Michel, will I hand over to you to give your comments? And for the people in the audience, if you have questions you'd like to raise, please write them in the chat, and I'll either call upon you to ask them yourselves if you want, or if not, I can ask them for you. So yeah, I look forward. I think we'll just stay all in this room, and then we can have a discussion after Michel has given his presentation. Thank you, Michel.
Thank you very much. And I think, yes, you can hear me. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to comment this book. I like a lot this book, as much as Elaine, probably. And I will be quick on what I particularly like about the book, because it's the same points than Elaine developed. So I will focus more on 3 points that are not critics, but things that I think could be further developed in the work of Mark. So I will not detail all the qualities of all what I like about the book. One thing which is not in the slide is the continuity of the thinking of Mark Granovetter, because there is many new things in that book compared to the previous work. But there is no contradiction. There is some kind of cumulation and sophistication of thinking very coherent. And that's a thing that I appreciate a lot. And I would also like to say that I appreciate also that there is no relational reductionism in that book and in the work of Mark. Because in the social network analysis, which I practice, sometimes there is this tendency to think that the social structure is only made of networks. And what I liked in that book is the focus on institutions. And I think that networks and institutions are very complementary in the understanding of social actions. So I would like to focus on 3 things that I think these things are already in the book, in the example that Marx uses, and a lot of part of the books, but I think they would deserve more theoretical development. The first thing is what I call collectives. It's a word I use, similar to groups or some other, to designate a set of people sharing resources. And so in the book, we have some terms like groups, small groups, self-contained communities. But I think it would be useful to have a more generic category to designate this kind of social entities, because these social entities have boundaries. Even if these boundaries are porous, fluctuant, they are also object of conflicts, but there are boundaries in the social world, and sometimes network analysts tend to underestimate this part of the social activity. And the second thing that I think could be more explicitly conceptualized is the material dimension of social life. And so we have a lot of work by people coming from social studies of science, like Karen Grossetti, Donald Mackenzie, or Michel, who brought a lot of analysis on the importance of devices, material things, or non-human things in the coordination of people in economic activity. So again, this is not absent in the book. There are many things that could be connected to this aspect in the book, but maybe it could be more explicit. We could have categories for that aspect of the social life. And that's what I suggest to the continuation of this work. And the third thing, I think that could be more conceptualized, it's the importance of coordination professionals. Institutions are not falling from the skies, they are maintained and developed by professionals. And in the fifth chapter, there are things about consultants in the choices of industrial organizations, but perhaps the book could include a more explicit conceptualization of the importance of this professional in the creation and the maintaining of institutions and the coordination of the social life, generally speaking, and into the social life, the economic activity as a part of it. So it's only these three things that I wanted to tell. So I wait for some comments by Mark and other participants. Thank you for attention.
Well, thank you, Michel, for a very excellent, concise provocation there. And can I invite people, if they have questions they'd like to raise, to either put them in the chat and I'll call upon you, or yeah, I'll kick off. I've got a question, Mark, I'd like to ask you to follow up on what, before you can respond to Michel and Elaine. And I wanted to ask you about this relationship that you're interested in exploring between informal personal relations and how they're formalized, and the argument that the formalization requires this informal relations to exist. In some ways, it seems to resonate with the ideas of Durkheim around the pre-contractual conditions to contract. So you can't actually contract with individuals unless they have a particular social status. And it's very much about, I think embeddedness captures that, because embeddedness is about dependency, and contracting is about, I'm only going to contract with you because you've got something I need that I can't get. So the first question to kick off was, how is your work, how does it build upon that, or how is it different? And the second question I had was very much interested in your discussions on slavery. And I have spent quite a lot of time reading Economy and Society from Weber on slavery. And I find it absolutely fascinating because he's extremely, there's no tears spilt in some of those sections. I mean, Weber argues that the decline of slavery, and first of all, he recognized the multi forms of slavery, for example, in Russia under serfdom and what you saw in the southern states of the United States are quite different. But one of the arguments he makes there is that the reason slavery ended wasn't because we suddenly discovered, oh, isn't this a terrible way to treat other human beings, and all those campaigns from humanists and liberals. But there's economic arguments, is that one, plantations were uneconomical, especially in contrast to the way industrialism was developing in the northern states, the United States. And secondly, technological change required workers to use more sophisticated tools. And this meant the system of managerial control by the plantation owners over the slave gangs was removed, and so that workers could use more sophisticated tools that didn't need such authoritarian regimes. But the way order or control was managed of the new workers was through the day wage rate, and not the slave owner no longer being responsible for looking after the family of the dependent workers. So that I just wanted to ask you, because I think it's a fascinating topic and one that has been coming to get more attention as we talk about modern slavery. So the question is, how's your work relate to Durkheim? And do you think do you think Weber was really, his arguments about the end of slavery were much more economic and technological rather than normative? That's a short version of the questions. So shall I kick off with that? I've got one other question in the chat. Shall I ask you first of all, would you like to respond to Elaine and Michel and my question, and then we'll go to Shearlaw? And if Shearlaw, if you want to put your camera on after Mark's responded to those, I'll go over to you. Mark, over to you, is that okay?
Sure. Well, I think that I think Elaine and Michel's comments were extremely interesting and valuable for me. I don't think they actually asked me questions that I need to answer, so I won't slow things down by answering their questions, but I certainly agree that the material dimension is very important in economic life, and perhaps I haven't paid it enough attention. I know that's a favorite topic of French sociologists, and I probably need to pay more attention to that socio-technical dimension. I agree with that. Professionals are extremely important. I can certainly agree with that, and there is a great deal more to say about that. I might have been able, so the review that Elaine was quoting from was originally a review of both my book and Piketty's book, his latest book. And maybe if she had talked about both, I would have had more to say. But I think that doesn't make a lot of sense to introduce that now. I will say now in response to some of Jackie's questions that Durkheim, of course, famously said there is more in contract than the purely contractual, but he didn't really pay a lot of attention to the way formal and informal institutions interact with one another. And so that's I think where we need to take that and pay attention to the details of formal institutions, and in particular, the way people in their informal interactions make use of formal institutions and how the two interact with one another, because the formal institutions don't come from nowhere. They come in part out of legal traditions and interactions that are informal and that accumulate into formal, and the way that Bernstein's analysis of contracts, and Lisa Bernstein's analysis of contracts, and how they pay careful attention to the informal dimensions of manufacturing industries. That's extremely important. So that's all. I think that Durkheim would be very happy to see those those arguments as extensions of what he himself was arguing. I have to say, I haven't really finished reading all the work that Weber has done on slavery. I think that economists have challenged the argument that slavery was not efficient. I think that there's an ongoing debate about that in American historiography, and I think it's too complicated for me to begin to get into. I will say that in the sharecropping regime that occupied the later half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century in the South, there are many reasons to think that the institution of sharecropping in the United States was responsible for technological backwardness that was fatal for the economy of the American South. But that's a bit of a long story and maybe one that I don't need to get into now. But you're absolutely right to point to Weber's work on slavery, and I need to pay a lot more attention to that and see what I can make of it and absorb that into my own comparative analysis of slavery. So
thanks. I think just the fact we actually have a recognition of modern day slavery legally through the law is very, very interesting, that this has actually become laws about how this is operating due to large patterns of migration that are changing. But that's maybe for another day to pick up in more detail. Okay, I've got a couple of questions from Sheer Law. Would you like to ask yours first if you want to? And then we have Yin Tan. Yeah, so Sheer Law, would you like to turn your camera on and ask the question? And could you introduce yourself, please, who you are and where you're from? Just so it makes it a bit more chatty and not that it's only mediated by the people that are on the panel. Sheila, are you there? I saw you a minute ago.
Yes, I'm
cool.
here.
You want to introduce yourself?
So I'm Stephen Sherlow. I'm working in Paris. I'm working in industry, but it's a subject I've been following for several years. And working in Paris, I'm interested in the work of Michel and his recent book. So my question is, in his recent book, Markets in the Making, he goes a step further. Okay, he puts society first in the initial steps, people launching products, innovating and creating links. But then he argues the market gets a grip on the situation. He uses a French word, emprise. So that's my question. Has Granovetter read this book? Does he agree with this sequence interactionist approach, that there's an interaction actually between society and economy, backwards and forwards, and there's not really a predominance of one sphere versus the other, apart from obviously human agency, which is fundamental. So that's my question.
So there's an easy answer, which is that I have not yet read the book. I look forward to reading it. I think that I'm often in sympathy with Calon's arguments, although they're different from mine. I might ask you if the book is in translation into English yet, or is it only in the original French? I mean,
It's
I can read it either way.
It's in translation at Princeton University Press, which you might have heard of that publisher.
Oh, I have heard of it, indeed. In fact, I was an undergraduate at Princeton, so I've been familiar with this for many years. That's where I got my training in history. The way you describe the argument, it sounds like something that I would be quite sympathetic to, but I clearly, and I'm often sympathetic to what Michel argues, although not in every detail, obviously. And I probably should make more use of the kind of arguments that the socio-technical sociologists like Calon and Latour and others have made. But I don't know this particular book, and I look forward, especially from your description, to becoming familiar with it. So thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much. Yin Tan, would you like to introduce yourself and ask your question, if you want to? And would you like to say where you're from?
Okay, yes, thanks for the opportunity. I'm Yin Tan, I'm from China, and now doing my PhD at University of Essex, and also in economic sociology. And I have a question for Professor Granovetter. Since I'm doing my PhD thesis on ethnic entrepreneurship and namely use the theory of social capital. So I'm curious about your new recent book. Is it any updates about the social capital theory after the weak ties? I think that part was quite inspiring for me. So I'd like to know if I can know more about these terms from your view. And that's
Sure.
my question.
Sure. I have actually some old essays on ethnic entrepreneurship. I don't know if you've seen those yet. They're from the 1990s, I think. You are familiar with them?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I have not yet had a chance to extend those in the second volume. I hope to work on that to some extent. It's a very interesting subject. I have a tendency to avoid the term social capital because I think it is so overused and misused. This is partly the fault of Bob Putnam, who is the one who has made the social capital such a popular term. And I think the problem with it is that it comes to be used as rather than an explanation, rather a substitute for an explanation. So whenever there's something going on that seems to be achieved by social means to achieve some economic goal, instead of trying to find out what those means are, people say, well, it's because they had more social capital. And that would be okay if we understood what that meant and where social capital came from and why it takes the form that it does. But it's often the case that people just say, we can explain it by saying there's a lot of social capital here. And that's not an explanation, it's actually a substitute for an explanation. So I prefer to understand what the actual mechanisms are that enable people to accomplish it. So social capital is often used as a term to mean that people have accomplished something by social means that you wouldn't have expected them to be able to accomplish. And I think that's a very interesting insight. But then the question is, well, then how did they do that? And calling it social capital, it gives it a name, but doesn't give it an explanation. So I think it's fine for people to call it social capital, but then that's just beginning of the discussion and not the end of the discussion. So I hope to work on that further. And you may have seen everything I've written on ethnic entrepreneurship, and you're saying you have, but I'll still send you some information about some stuff you may not have seen. And actually, I have old draft chapters where I talk about this more. So I can try to dig those up and see if those would be helpful to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Thank you, Mark, as well. For the very last question, because we've had quite a long session today, I'd like to open up to Jennifer Lee. Would you like to ask your question and introduce yourself, who you are and where you're from? And that will be the last question before we all close up, because it's a long evening in Europe, it's even longer evening in Asia, and it's early morning. All the Californians need to get out jogging. So Jennifer, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jacqueline. Hello, I'm Jennifer Lee. I'm a first-year PhD student at INSEAD in the Fontainebleau campus in France. So to Professor Granovetter, I have two main questions. One is that you, in your discussion of your books and how you organize it, you mentioned that you disliked poor cultural explanations. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about like what you would consider then a good cultural explanation, particularly because I am interested in actually studying culture myself. And so I do want to ensure that future research is solid and grounded. And then my second question was about how, if you had any views or opinions about how like technological developments, for instance, things like Zoom or any like virtual technological developments influences our like individual personal relationships as well as impersonal relationships.
Okay, well, those are each questions that anyone could spend hours talking about, but obviously that would not be within the ground rules that have been set out. And just for the record, I don't need to go out jogging because I was out for a long time earlier with my dog, and that's quite enough. I think that what is a good cultural explanation, I think we have to keep in mind, and for me, the fundamental contribution on this was Ann Swidler's 1989 article, I think, on what culture means and what it is, and how it is a toolkit, to use her well-known expression, that the culture is a collection of ideas that people can draw on when they're trying to achieve various kinds of goals, and they are conceptual items. They are things that are out there in the discourse in a particular population, so that they're not material. They are ideational, and they are ways of thinking, and there are only a certain number of ways of thinking about the world in any particular population, and people draw on those, and they don't have an unlimited toolkit. They have the cultural conceptions of the way the world works that are offered in their population, and they can draw on them, but those do not determine behavior. They are simply ways that people can think about behavior and help them think about how they might achieve the goals that they have. And so people do need ways of thinking about what they're doing. And I think that's what culture provides, but they don't, the idea that culture, they're the old kind of simplistic ideas that culture is a thing that completely controls your behavior, and everything you do is just a reflection of your culture, as if you had no agency. That's what we have to avoid, and we have to figure out in what way culture really is out there as something that people can make use of, and how they make use of it, and what determines how they make use of it, and why they make use of one piece of it rather than some other piece of it. So I think there's a lot to know, and so this is epistemology, and it's pragmatist epistemology particularly. And if you read the work of John Dewey, for example, he talks a lot about, I don't remember whether he actually uses the word culture, but the ways he talks about the ideas that people use in trying to figure out what it is they're going to do, I think are very closely related to what we think of as culture. So I think that's very important to think about, and it needs a lot more development. And there are people who are working on it now, but there's a lot still to understand about that. As for how technology affects our behavior, can you expand on that question a bit?
So I guess I was wondering, if I was relating this to kind of how maybe people are placed in more situations in which they, I guess, meet more people that are strangers. So you mentioned that, like, I'm trying to reference my notes. You mentioned how, like, what was it? Let's see. Like the familiarity of strangers, right? You talked about. And so I was wondering if you saw, like, any developments with, like, these growing technologies in which, I guess, there are more opportunities in which individuals could meet strangers, if you will, could influence how we see or evaluate our relationships with other individuals.
So let me present a puzzle, which I think is very interesting from the point of view of this question, and the puzzle is the following. There used to be a lot of data showing that the way people met the people that they would eventually marry was through their social networks, that the people that they would become eventually spouses with were friends of friends, or relatives of friends, or friends of relatives, and there was a long tradition of showing that this was the case. In recent years, there's been very interesting line of research, pioneered especially by my colleague Michael Rosenfeld, showing that now that's no longer true. The way people meet spouses now is typically online. So they meet them through Match.com or OkCupid or whatever the worldwide equivalents of those are. And so that's a very interesting fact, and that probably it has to do with the fact that it was actually always, it had always been the case for people who were gay, because the number of possible significant others was much smaller. But now it's the case for people who are gay or straight. And so that's very interesting. On the other hand, there's the question of how people find jobs, which is one I've been interested in, obviously, for a long time. And what I am finding, and what my colleagues in economics who have looked into this are finding, is that it is still the case that people are finding jobs through people that they know, often weak ties. And part of the reason for this is that one of the things that technology accomplishes is that you can keep track of people that you don't know very well for a period of many years, much more easily than you ever could before. So you have many more weak ties than you ever did before. And the potential for finding jobs to those people is greater than it ever was before. And so even though there are hundreds and thousands of jobs posted online, that isn't mainly the way people are finding jobs. They're still finding jobs just the way they used to. So here's this puzzle that for finding spouses, it's mostly now online. For finding jobs, the affordances on the technological affordances online are making it possible for people to do what they always did, which is to find their jobs through social networks. So it's an interesting puzzle that these two different things that we need to find significant others, and we need to find jobs. One has gone over to this completely technological device and the other has not, although the technological device has become important for it. So there's very little research on either of these, although there's more on finding of spouses, and why one is one way and the other is the other way is, I think, one of the most interesting questions we can ask about the impact of technology on our personal lives. So rather than answer your question, I posed an interesting question, but one that, there is some research, and I did cite some of the research, so maybe that starts to answer the question. But it's often the case that the best answer to a question is to pose another question. So there I have done that.
There's some very interesting work on comparing job adverts. Some colleagues in Switzerland were looking at 19th century job adverts and marriage adverts and comparing them to those in the 1970s. And they found a parallel between, so it was interesting, people do get them through their social networks, but even back in the 19th century, you still had to advertise for a suitable bachelor or woman spinster, saying things like, the adverts in the 19th century were like, clean cut, reasonable income, church going, punctual and orderly. And the job adverts were very similar.
Well, those must have been from Switzerland.
Yeah. And in the 70s, they were more like people having emotional intelligence. So they changed what we wanted to be is people, it didn't matter what you wore or if you washed yourself or anything. It's like you had worked in a team, you had all these kinds of other characteristics. But anyway, that's a discussion for what would have been a meeting in the pub in Amsterdam that I'm afraid which won't be happening right now. But can I just...
No, but you could give me that reference. I'd be interested.
Oh yeah, I'm going to look at it. I'll send it to you because it's a really nice piece of work. It's a while since I spoke to them. Well, first of all, can I bring things to a close because we've had quite a long session, and I want to first of all obviously thank Mark for providing us a really fascinating, rich, provocative contribution from his own work. And we chose Mark because one of the themes of the conference is about connections. It's very influenced by his work. And so hopefully this is a starter to think about what do they mean in the past, in the future. I also want to congratulate Mark because he's off to Bilbao to collect his prize for the BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge. So enjoy Spain and all it has to offer. Can I also thank Elaine and Michel for providing critical input? We appreciate you participating. And also to Jacob and the SASE team for making the wheels keep turning around. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I'm really glad also, can I say, that lots of young scholars were confident in asking questions. That's absolutely what we want to include, that you're part of it and not So that, thank you very much for you as well. And have a lovely day in California. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.